All right, that's better. Okay, so this is the seventh lesson in our series on how to read the Bible for all it's worth. So we're kind of halfway. Tonight we are going to be talking about wisdom literature. And we'll get into which books that is, which books those are here in a second. So we've gone from an introduction. We talked about biblical translations. We talked about reading Old Testament narratives, the law, the prophets, the Psalms. Maybe forgetting something in there, but anyway, now we are here at wisdom. There are generally four, sometimes depending on who you talk to, sometimes three, but there are generally four books that are regarded as the wisdom books. These are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, and the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. That's not to say that these books are the only source of wisdom, because obviously there is wisdom in all of Scripture. When we look at it properly, it is instructive and is full of wisdom. But those are the wisdom books, and these are going to be what we're talking about tonight, how to read each of these, and also how they interact with one another, because I feel like that's something that I've learned from this study, is just how the books work together to provide the reader or the student, ourselves, with a fuller understanding of how life works and how life doesn't work. So before we talk about the books, I do want to talk a little bit just about the theme of wisdom. So just like we said before, the wisdom books are not the only source of instruction and teaching and wisdom on how to live. And a lot of the themes that you'll see, especially in Proverbs, go all the way back to the garden. So really quickly, the garden event where God presents Adam and Eve with the garden and all the trees. There are two trees said to be in the center of the garden: the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the Hebrew word for evil is ra, and really maybe a better way to think about that is just the word bad, because the word evil in English brings with it all this connotation. But the Hebrew word ra doesn't necessarily bring that much to the table, because it could just mean something that's bad. I mean, there are figs that are raw in Scripture. So it doesn't mean that the figs are evil. They're evil figs. It just means they're bad. They're spoiled figs. Now, there are people that are raw, and this could mean an evil or a wicked person. But I think it's helpful just to think about the tree as the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And everywhere we see that phrase appear, knowledge of good and bad, it's talking about children. There are several passages, but each of them are talking about how a child thinks. A child doesn't know good from bad. So something that's kind of implicit in this garden narrative is the idea that these two humans, Adam and Eve, need wisdom. God has just made them king and queen over all creation. So the idea is that they will need wisdom. But the choice set before them between the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad is, what is the source of that wisdom? Where are they going to look for that wisdom? So the tree of life, what they were supposed to do, again, this is implicit in the text. It's not explicitly stated, but I think it makes good sense of what's going on. The idea is that God is going to teach them, that God is going to raise his children to know good from bad, and they will have access to the tree of life as long as they do that, as long as they look to him for this knowledge. The tree of the knowledge of good and bad represents being able to, being wise in your own eyes. That phrase appears a lot in Proverbs. But you see, all in Genesis 1, God is seeing things and defining them as good. God sees this as good. The first time we see someone else besides God say something is good, it's Eve when she is looking at the fruit. It says Eve saw that the fruit was good and she desired it. So the idea behind the people taking the fruit for themselves, it's the idea of being wise in your own eyes. They didn't trust that God was going to give them the wisdom that they needed. They wanted to take it for themselves, and that's what leads to all these problems. So you see in Proverbs, wisdom is called a tree of life. So the idea is that God's wisdom, allowing God to define wisdom, is that path to the tree of life. And that's what should have happened. We should have let God define what's good and evil. We should have let him teach us, and then we would have access to the tree of life. But the other side is being wise in your own eyes, trying to take it for yourself. Do what feels good, do what makes sense to you, instead of relying on God and letting him define what is good and what is bad. So some of those themes, they go all the way back to the garden. They go all the way back to the beginning. And so it's important to have that idea when you go to the wisdom books. All right. So we talked about kind of what is wisdom. Wisdom is letting God define your choices. Living according to his standards and not your own. But that's not all that is. Because the word for wisdom in Hebrew, chokmah, I'm probably butchering these pronunciations, but I like to try. It's kind of fun. But that word doesn't just appear when someone is wise. It also appears when someone is skilled in something. So like the people who worked on the tabernacle were said to be full of wisdom. So they have skill in some area. And so the idea is that you are skilled at life. You are skilled at making decisions. And what you're doing is you're using this skill to follow God's direction. There are other ancient Near Eastern wisdom poetry. The Bible is not necessarily unique in the sense that it is the only source of ancient wisdom. There are lots of other writings that have this idea of how do I live the best life, and talking about those. But what is unique about the Bible is that it adds the element that God gets to define what is good and what is bad, and the whole idea of the fear of the Lord. That's a big thing we'll talk about here in just a second with Proverbs. Is talking about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So that's what's unique about the biblical perspective, is that having reverence for God, understanding there is a higher authority, that's the beginning. Letting him decide what is good and what is bad, and not trying to do it for yourself, not trying to live the easiest life, not trying to be the most frugal necessarily, but doing instead what is right in God's eyes and not what is right in your own eyes. So all those things are kind of going into this whenever the Bible is talking about wisdom. All those kinds of things are interacting. So it helps to just kind of have that in the back of your mind. So let's get into Proverbs. So Proverbs is a type of wisdom called proverbial wisdom. Go figure. So a lot of the book, and what we tend to think of with the book, is all those quick little snippets and all those little sayings. But before we get to those, we want to talk about how the beginning of the book works. The first 9 chapters are different than what we generally think of. The book's broken up into 3 different sections. Chapters 1 through 9 are all these poems from a father to a son. about the wise life. So again, all this is poetry. So all the rules of Hebrew poetry still apply. We're still under the umbrella of poetry. So if you have don't remember what we were talking about, you can go back and listen to some other ones, and hopefully you'll find just some of those basic tips in there. So all the rules of poetry still apply. But the first 9 chapters are several poems talking about a father to a son, about how to choose the wise life, how to live by the fear of the Lord. Again, that idea that a respect for God as the highest authority is the first step to a wise life. There's also a lot of poems that personify wisdom as a woman, and personify her as an essential attribute of God, something that God used when creating everything. And we see wisdom as this woman who is going around and making her appeal. She's trying to win people to her side, and she's open to anybody, because we all have the chance to make a wise choice. We all have the opportunity every day, every choice, to make the godly choice, to make the right choice. So those first 9 chapters are a little bit different than what we generally think of with those quick little proverbs, but they set up the ideas of the fear of the Lord and this personified attribute of God, Lady Wisdom, and there's also Lady Folly. So trying to instruct the listener how to choose the wise life. So after you get through those, we're going to talk here for several minutes about the rest of the book. So there's the first 9 chapters, then there's the bulk of the book from 10 to I think 27, 28 maybe, and then the last couple of chapters are from 2 other people, King Lemuel and then Agur, I think is his name, but they're oracles from them. So most of the book is generally attributed to Solomon. We don't know 100% if he wrote all of it, but regardless, a lot of these, some of these books have an association to Solomon, and so that's part of what puts it in that wisdom category, is its associations with Solomon. And even if it wasn't all written by him, it's kind of under that Solomon, it's of Solomon because it's a wisdom thing. A similar example might be how you might talk about all movies as being, you might say Hollywood, talking about all movies, even though not all movies are filmed or produced or made in Hollywood. So similar idea. When you're talking about wisdom, a lot of times you can say it is of Solomon because he is kind of the name associated with wisdom in ancient Israel. So how should we read all of those little proverbs, those quick snippets about how to live life? So there's tons of examples, but I'm actually going to talk about a couple of English ones and use those as kind of a springboard to get into how to read some of the ancient Hebrew ones. So a couple of English examples of proverbs would be "Look before you leap." So proverbs are not worded necessarily to be exact. They're also not always literal, but they're worded to be memorable. Let me put it that way. So look before you leap. There's a repetition of that L sound, so it's memorable. It's more memorable than saying, always consider your options before taking on a task. I mean, that's not nearly as catchy or memorable as look before you leap. So that's a lot of what's going on in Hebrew. There's repetitions of sounds, or there's rhyming, but again, we lose a lot of that in the translation. But when you look at the proverb, look before you leap, like I said, it's catchy, it's memorable, but it's not literal. I mean, how often do we hear that and think about actually jumping? I mean, is this really talking about jumping? It doesn't tell us where to look. It doesn't tell us how to look. It doesn't tell us how long after looking do we leap. And like I said, it's not really not even talking about leaping at all. So again, it's not designed to be exactly precise. It is meant to be a general rule that is catchy and can be applied to other situations beyond itself, beyond the literal interpretation. Another one is a stitch in time saves 9. So I honestly didn't really know what this one was before reading this book. It always confused me. So a stitch in time saves 9. Again, there's kind of that rhyme in there. Not a true rhyme, but it's close. And so again, it sticks in your mind. Again, it's a lot more memorable than saying, an action that's taken preventatively early on in a course can prevent, numerous issues later on down the road. Again, that's not catchy, and that's not well worded by me either. But again, it's probably not talking about sewing. It's just talking about how to, by correcting something early on, you're going to prevent issues down the road. But again, the way that it accomplishes that, the way that it teaches that, is a short, pithy, memorable saying that is not literal, not meant to be taken literally. So that's how so many of these proverbs function. Again, the biggest thing is they're not meant to be literal. They're meant to apply to other situations outside of themselves. They're meant for you to find the wisdom principle behind it and then apply that to other things in your life. So a lot of these proverbs are intensely practical. A lot of them aren't even theological in nature. They're probably talking about, they talk about all kinds of things, from debts to how you manage your relationships, not rushing into hasty marriages. I mean, they address all kinds of things, and not all of them have a direct theological message. A lot of them are just intensely practical. So again, don't over literalize, and don't narrow it down. Learn the principle from it, and learn to apply it to other areas in your life. A lot of them are worded as if it's from a older person to a younger person. So again, a lot of these are meant to be preventative, not corrective necessarily. So if one of them is talking, like there's one that says, it's better to live on the corner of your roof than inside your house with a quarrelsome wife. So the idea behind that is I should be careful who I marry. So preventative, future, looking to the future, versus corrective, like, hey, don't live with that person anymore because they're quarrelsome. So it's worded generally to be thought of from an older person to a younger person who's setting out in life, not someone who, again, that proverb is not saying that you should, if you're married, that you should end it because they're quarrelsome. And it's saying, be careful who you spend your life with. Make sure that's a good decision. Make sure that you think it through. A lot of proverbs too, they need some translating. There's one that says, if you tell the truth, you'll have the king as a friend. So we don't have a king. Very, very few countries in the world still have royalty. The idea is, if you are upright, you are more likely to have people in leadership positions respect you. So there's usually there can be some translating that needs to go on, but for the most part, we can do that just with some good old common sense and good exegesis, like we've been talking about, and get the arrive at the good meaning once we kind of cross the historical distance. So if you take some proverbs out of their context, they could seem overly frugal, materialistic, sometimes withholding, talking about not taking on debts and not doing this, but they're not meant to convey a selfish or materialistic lifestyle. Again, they're just intensely practical, And so much of the beginning of the book is talking about the fear of the Lord, and there are plenty of them that talk about being generous and things like that. But so you don't want to over literalize or take them out of their context too much. And then the last thing I want to say about these proverbs is that proverbs are not promises. So ones that say something like, "Commit your plans to the Lord and they will succeed," that is not a promise. Okay. These are proverbs, again, short, memorable sayings that are a good rule to live by, but they are not guarantees. So you can't just commit whatever crazy plan you want to the Lord and then it works out. It's not a manipulation tactic. It's not a formula that if you follow this must happen afterward. So they're just, again, they're proverbs, not promises, not guarantees, but they talk about how things should work and how things work most of the time. So generally, if you are wise, if you are practical, if you think things through, you will have better luck than someone who rushes into things, doesn't think things through, is dishonest, all those kinds of things. But again, they're proverbs, not promises, not guarantees, but they are a good rule to live by. Next, we're going to get into Ecclesiastes. And for many people, including myself, Ecclesiastes was something I did not know how to deal with. Didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because it seemed depressing and really confusing. But I really have come to appreciate Ecclesiastes by studying it more and hearing from some people who are much smarter than me on how to interpret it. So Ecclesiastes and Job are types of wisdom called speculative wisdom. So proverbial wisdom was what we talked about a minute ago, where it's all these short little sayings. Speculative wisdom comes through these long, so in the case of Ecclesiastes, it's this long monologue. And in Job, it's a case of these very long dialogues where they're talking through life and how things work. So this is an example of what's called speculative wisdom. So there are two main or two different ways you can think about Ecclesiastes. And it's interesting, one author of the book thinks about it one way and the other one thinks about it the other way. So I'm going to lay them out really quickly, and then you can kind of decide where you think the book is. Either way, it's useful and helpful for learning, but it's interesting to know that there are these two things. So again, Ecclesiastes is associated with Solomon. We don't know if he wrote it per se, but it is in that wisdom tradition that has his name attached to it. And there are two people present in the book. There is the narrator, and he is responsible for the prologue and the epilogue. And then there is the teacher, our often translated teacher, or the one who is responsible for the overwhelming majority of the book, the whole chunk in the middle. And so one interpretation looks at everything that is said by the teacher is what's called a foil. Basically, we are not supposed to agree with it. We are supposed to disagree with it, and by presenting this counter view, it illuminates how we should think about something, if that makes sense. Almost like the bulk of the book is playing devil's advocate with you. It's pointing out all these things, and you're supposed to read it and think, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that either. And so it helps you define what you believe by presenting the opposite. So in this foil theory, the teacher is expressing how you would live life in what's called like a deistic world, where there is a God, but he's very distant. He just kind of got the wheels turning and stepped back, and also there's no afterlife. So that's one perspective. So when you read it, you could look at that and think, this was an example of what's called cynical wisdom. Basically, there is no afterlife. There's no God that really is here and cares. So this is how you should live. And again, you're not really supposed to agree with it, but you are supposed to kind of agree with the narrator, who gives you the prologue and the epilogue, which kind of serve to contrast what the teacher is saying. The other perspective is that the teacher is presenting a view that you should agree with, and that the narrator is kind of summarizing the teacher's statements at the beginning and at the end. And this is the one that I like better. I think it makes a little bit more sense. But again, you can read the book for yourself. It doesn't take that long, and kind of decide where you think it falls. So getting into the book, there are two phrases and a word in Hebrew that, for me, really helped me understand the book. The word we see a lot, either in English translations, is usually vanity or meaningless, and it appears almost 40 times in the book. Meaningless. Oh, excuse me. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Or vanity. Everything is vanity. The Hebrew word for that is hevel, and what it means most literally is vapor, or it could also mean smoke. And for me, that really kind of helped me figure out where the teacher's mind is, because he says, hevel, everything is hevel. It's this also is hevel, and a chasing after the wind. So when he says hevel and wind so close to each other, again, you think about vapor. Think about watching smoke. It's obviously there. You can see it. It leaves a shadow. If you've ever watched smoke rise from a fire and watch the sunlight, like, there's a shadow. It leaves a shadow. But if you try to grab it, there's nothing. It evades your grasp. It's elusive. And so I don't think the teacher is saying that things are really meaningless. I think he means things are fleeting, temporary, frustrating, paradoxical, confusing. Life is an enigma. And to me, that really just kind of helped me understand the teacher's perspective. Because again, I don't think it's saying that literally everything is just meaningless. I think he means that life just doesn't make sense sometimes. Life is confusing, and that's what so much of the book is about. He talks, there are kind of three main topics that he talks about. The first one is time, how time never ends. Everything, there's nothing new under the sun. There's a time for this, there's a time for that. The earth was here before us, the earth was here after us. Everything we do is going to be forgotten, so it's hevel. Another one he talks about a lot is death. That death comes to everyone, whether you are rich, whether you are poor, whether you are wise, whether you are a fool. Death. Everybody dies in the end. Hevel. This is hevel, because things just don't work out the way that you think that they should. So the other phrase I wanted to say, so hevel, thinking about that word, really kind of helped me put the book into a better perspective. The other phrase I wanted to say is under the sun. So there is nothing new under the sun. So when he says under the sun, he means during this life, during our time here on earth. And so to me, like I said earlier, all of these wisdom books are talking to each other and interacting with one another to give us, the student, a well-rounded picture of how we should live, how we should think about life. And so Ecclesiastes is almost a response to Proverbs. I heard it put this way, and I really liked it. Proverbs is like a college professor who has designed their class so that only the people who study do well. They have structured the material that you can't cheat, you can't just make it up, you can't figure it out on your own. You have to study, You have to put in the work. You have to come to class. And if you do those things, you will succeed. You will pass my class if you do these things. And so we look at Proverbs and think, yeah, this is how life should work. The good get rewarded, the wicked punished. Work hard, get rewarded. Don't work hard, things get taken away from you. You don't have enough money to even have a bed anymore. You make wise decisions, good things happen. You make foolish decisions, bad things happen. So that's kind of how Proverbs is. It's how things should be and how things are oftentimes, but not always. So Ecclesiastes, I think about Ecclesiastes is someone who is a little bit older and has been out in the workforce for many years. And they say to Proverbs, hey, Proverbs, that's great. It's great that you've structured your class that way, but let me tell you, sometimes the people that work hard, they get fired. Sometimes the people who get promoted aren't the people that work hard. They're just the people that know somebody. My boss is younger than me. I'm speaking as Ecclesiastes, not me personally, but maybe their boss is maybe Ecclesiastes says my boss is younger than me. He just got to where he is because he knew the owner. I work hard and I get a flat tire. And the person who's reckless, the person who's a fool, they live a long life. The righteous get cancer and die. The foolish gets a promotion and gets a fancy new car and lives to be 80 or 90 years old. So Ecclesiastes is almost this response to Proverbs, saying that life here under the sun doesn't always make sense. It doesn't add up. And so how should we live in a world where things don't make sense? In a world where not everything's fair? How should we live? And so the teacher goes through all these things and kind of deconstructs them. Do I live for pleasure? That's hevel. Do I try to get more and more and more wisdom? Even that is hevel. That's vapor. That's meaningless. That's not going to get you what you want. And so really the teacher just talks about moderation and trying to enjoy life, even though it doesn't make sense, even though life is crazy, even though life is confusing and life is frustrating, and sometimes bad things happen to good people. Even though all those things are going on, it still is best to try to be wise and live for God. Even though this life doesn't make sense, even though this life is crazy, that's the best way to live. And so to me, I like to see it that way. I tend to read what the teacher says and actually agree with it. That life is confusing, that life doesn't make sense. And so I don't side on the foil angle that the teacher is somebody we should disagree with and the narrator is someone that we should agree with. I don't personally find their messages contradictory. I just kind of see the narrator as summing up the teacher, what the teacher is saying. But seriously, read it for yourself. It's really good. Anyway, thinking about those things has really helped me come to a better understanding of the book and more of an appreciation, appreciating the presence of Ecclesiastes. Because if all we had was Proverbs, that's not true. I mean, a lot of things in Proverbs are generally true, but life doesn't always work out that way. And so to me, it's really helpful that Ecclesiastes is there, that Ecclesiastes, again, Ecclesiastes doesn't give us the answers, but it makes us address the tough questions. It makes us aware of the tough questions. All right, man, time goes by so fast. Okay, so we're going to get to Job. So most of us know, kind of the introduction of Job, but we may not know all of its features and components. So Job is again another exploration of what is the meaning of life, what do we do, how are we supposed to understand our life, and why things happen. So the big question of Job is kind of similar to what we talked about with Ecclesiastes, but it's why do bad things happen to good people? So in the prologue, so Job also is framed by a prologue and an epilogue that are in prose versus poetry. And most of us know the basic outline. Job is righteous and has lots of good things. And God is having a big assembly meeting. And he says, hey, everybody, look at Job. Job is great. But then someone opposes. Someone disagrees with God. And says, well, maybe Job only follows you because he knows you're going to bless him. Maybe Job is just kind of working the system. And maybe if you take things away from Job, then, he'll curse you. He won't follow you anymore, because he's not getting what he wants anymore. And so God says, okay, let's test your theory. And then all these terrible things happen to Job. And then he initially, continues to worship God. And 3 friends come to comfort him. And the basic message of them is that it must be your fault, Job. It has to be. And Job just continually refutes them. And then a 4th friend shows up and he says, well, Job, it's still your fault, but maybe God did this not in response to something that you did, but as a preventative. Maybe God did this to prevent you from doing something, but ultimately it was going to be your fault anyway. And then God shows up and kind of sets everybody straight. So I really like... I was shown a diagram about how to think of Job, and so I really like it, and I really feel like it helped me, so maybe it'll help you. So I have a little whiteboard I'm going to draw for just a second. So what I was shown was you could think about Job and the arguments of each of its characters as a triangle. And on the 3 points of the triangle is a different idea. And each character has 2 sides of or one side of the triangle and 2 points of the triangle that they agree with, and so they don't agree with the third. So let me draw this and I'll show you. I probably should have had this drawn before I got started. That would have been better. Sorry. I have to write very slow if I want it to be legible. I hope I spelled all those words right. All right, so here is our triangle. Oh man, it's backwards. Oh no. Okay. I really should have thought about that. So anyway, here's our triangle. And man, I hope you can read that. Anyway, the top one says God is just. Okay? This one down here says retribution principle. The retribution principle is the idea, kind of like we talked about in Proverbs, that good people are rewarded, wicked people suffer. And that's how life works. And then the final part here is Job's innocence. So Job's friends, they come along and they say, well, we know God is just, and we know that God runs the world according to this retribution principle, that good people get what good people get good and bad people get bad. So we know these 2 things are true, Job. So this must be the problem. You must not be innocent. You have done something to oppose or to cause all this. It is your fault. You've done something wrong. Job comes along and says, nope, I know I'm innocent. And the world should run this way. The world should run where the good get good and the bad get bad. So God must not be just. Now you may be confused because at first Job does hold on to his, he holds on to his integrity. He, praises God, but as it goes on, he says some pretty terrible things about God, about how God is a bully, how God takes pleasure in watching people suffer. Job really is in a dark place. So he eventually says, God is not just. God shows up at the end and says, "Yep, I'm just. And you know what, Job? You are innocent. But let me ask you, Job, is this how I have to run the world? Is it your place to tell me how to run the universe?" Okay, Job. If it's your place to tell me how to run the universe, then I'm going to ask you some questions. I want you to answer them for me. And in the last few chapters of Job, God just kind of lets him have it and just asks him all these things. Do you know how this works? Do these things report to you? Do you understand even this? And so, and then he finishes talking about the behemoth and the Leviathan. And basically just, Job, the universe is more complex than you know. And the world I've created is good, but it's dangerous. We're talking about the behemoth and the Leviathan. It's dangerous. You can't run the world for even a day, Job. So you can't talk. And Job repents and says, I spoke about things I didn't understand. And so we don't really get an answer as to why bad things happen to good people. The answer we get is that God is in control and that his ways and his thoughts are higher than ours. So as frustrating as that might be, the idea is that we need to trust. So again, Proverbs is like that college professor who says, I've designed my class that only the studious pass. Ecclesiastes says, well, I'm glad that that's the way your class is structured, but that's not how life works. Job would be kind of an older person who says, you know what, you're both right, but the most important thing is just to trust God and put it in his hands. And so to me, it really helped me to think about all these books interacting with one another and talking to one another and talking to us about how we should think about life and how we should try to live in light of all these things. Again, it still makes sense to try to live wise, to live by God's rules, to live by the fear of the Lord. But it's not a guarantee. Bad things do happen, and we just need to trust and understand that we are not in control. God is bigger than us. The universe is more complex than we could ever imagine, and just to trust in him. Really briefly, we're just going to talk just for a second about the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. You might be asking, how is this wisdom literature? Well, the quickest answer is that it's associated with Solomon. So again, anything associated with Solomon kind of has that wisdom label attached to it. The Song of Songs has a long history of odd interpretations. A lot of people, both Jews and Christians over the years, have attempted to allegorize the story and make it into a love story between God and Israel, or Christ and the church. And they looked at some of the love poetry in the prophets as kind of their starting place for doing that. That has kind of fallen out of favor more recently, and I think for good reason. I don't really feel like that as the primary interpretation really holds up to the content of the book. So really there is a lot of wisdom in understanding how to handle and how to deal with our desire and our passions. And so I think it's also outlining how healthy and beneficial a monogamous romantic relationship can be. But there's also lots of cautions in the book to, don't awaken love before it so desires, and just being careful when you're dealing with love, how powerful it is, both for good, but also it can be dangerous, and how we deal with it. So again, there are a lot of other interpretations, people putting second meanings into things. Like I said, I don't buy into the allegorizing of making it something about like about Christ and the church, because honestly I feel like if that were to be the primary interpretation, some New Testament author would have mentioned it, but as far as I know, it's not in there. I think it really is about human desire, human emotion, and how we should be fulfilled by that, how we should enjoy that, but how we should be careful with that. I do think, for me personally, I do think that there could be a little bit of a second meaning in how it talks about. It uses some of the same language in that's present at the fall, about how God tells the woman that your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. Well, in the Song of Songs, the woman says that her husband, or her, I believe they're supposed to be kind of betrothed, that her beloved's desire is for me. And so to me, I almost see it as kind of a, how when we engage with one another correctly, that we can kind of go back to that pre-fall state of desiring one another, and there not being any distrust or competition, or there's no fracturing of the relationship like happened at the fall. And so again, there's a lot of different interpretations. I don't agree with the allegorizing, but I do think maybe there's some of that in there, because it uses some of the same language that we see in the curses of the fall, and we could see maybe how there's almost this reversal if we live with one another with a mutual desire, with a mutual respect and love and adoration for one another. Again, those are kind of the wisdom books. And if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. We are going to get into the New Testament next week. We're going to start in the Gospels. So if you are tired of the Old Testament, we are out of it. We're going to be getting into the New Testament starting next week. So thank you for joining. Please let me know if you have any comments or questions, and hope you have a great week. Thanks.